Well, welcome everyone to the session 2A of the NERI Labour Market Conference. We've 4 papers in this session, and the theme is in-job precarity. I am going to start away so we have as much time for presentations and questions as possible with Dr. Lauren Bari from the Human Resources Management in Cork University Business School, and her paper today looking at trends in solo or freelance self-employment 2003-2019. So Lauren, I will hand over to you. Excellent.
Are you unmuting me or am I unmuting myself? I think I've
you were there a second ago. You're nearly.
Can everyone hear me now?
We can hear you now. That's
yeah,
perfect. Sorry. Great stuff.
And people can see the slides okay, yeah?
Yep.
Thank you. And this is an area that I started looking at. So this is about trends in women's solo or freelance self-employment from 2003. And it's data I started looking at when I was at the University of Limerick a few years ago. And it's an area that I just thought was a really interesting area because of how this particular form of work is associated with perceptions of work-life balance, flexibility, gender issues, and also precarity. So it sort of ties in a lot of interesting areas. And as the Labour Force Survey new data comes out, I update the findings. And I know last year I presented on gender differences in self-employment working arrangements. So this year I just want to present some aspects of some of the trends that came out over time during this period. Just 1 or 2 aspects of that. So hold on now, I'll just try to. Okay, so definitions are sort of important when you're looking at this because, you know, a lot of the different data that comes out talking about self-employment or talking about freelance work will have different ways of defining what they're talking about. And even just from a sort of conceptual point of view, you know, you hear a lot of talk about freelance work, you might hear independent professionals, you might even hear entrepreneurs, solo self-employed. And when it comes down to it, there's not a huge amount of difference often in these descriptions, in these different categories, particularly not when you're looking at data on it. So the definitions of what exactly I'm talking about in this research is quite important. You can see the OECD definition is where people work on their own business. The Eurofound definition is those who work in their own business, professional practice or farm, and who employ no other persons. So in this, I chose not to look at agricultural sectors because that was the only real thing, the only factor that sort of differentiated the idea of freelance work from self-employment or solo self-employment. So other than the fact that I'm not looking at agricultural sectors, really I could be talking about any sort of solo self-employment, freelance work, and there's a huge, you know, there's a very wide range there. You can look at the criteria for freelance particularly, you would see that they would have a high degree of autonomy, be paid per task, might have a short relationship with clients and take on business risk. So, you know, even looking at the whole idea of entrepreneurship, some of the ways in which that is described is not easily differentiated from these other definitions. So just to be clear, I'm looking at non-agricultural self-employment where there are no employees. Just the Eurostat figures there very quickly, just to see where Ireland is in relation to other European countries for self-employment in general. So they've included agriculture in this and self-employed employers, but it's 14% of the labour force is the EU average. You can just see Ireland is ever so slightly above that there. So we'd be just close to the EU average just in terms of self-employment as a proportion of the labour market or the labour force in general. And some other sort of just stats from in terms of self-employment at EU level, there's been some sort of changes, you know, some interesting trends, because solo self-employment, so self-employment where there's no employees as a proportion of overall self-employment has been growing. in recent years. So just growing from 66% to 71% between 2002 and 2017. So this idea of the freelancer, the independent, solo self-employed person becoming more prevalent within self-employment in general. The female self-employment rate in the EU, according to OECD figures, is 9.6% of the overall labour force. But when you start looking within solo self-employment to different types, for example, within professional self-employment and within this idea of freelancers, however that is defined, you can see that women make up a higher percentage of that sort of category of self-employment. 44%, according to the European Commission, of professional self-employed are actually women. So the gender gap has tended to be wide in self-employment, but when you look within particular types, that gender gap is narrower. And the proportion of overall self-employment, like I said, that is solo or without employees, and that also which is part-time, has increased, with women more likely than men to be in these categories. So at a European level, we can see that women are more likely than men to be in solo part-time self-employment. So I really wanted to have a look at the Irish data and just to see how that, fared out in Ireland. And as well, just that link with precarity. Solo part-time self-employment is one of the most precarious forms of labour market activity in terms of being low paid, insecure, not subject to collective representation, and that kind of those sorts of elements of precarity. And just looking in Ireland, then you can just see the differences in the composition of self-employment in general. So what the proportion of self-employed that are solo as opposed to employers, so those business owners which do have employees, quite large changes between 2003 and 2019. So you can see then the solo self-employed accounted for 55%, and in 2019 it had gone up to 70%. So changes in the overall proportion of self-employed that do not hire employees. So just some interesting changes there. And the reason, like I said, that I started looking at this, the sort of background reasons, was because of that link with gender, work-life balance, precarity, all these issues were sort of intersecting within this form of work. And some of the background things that were relevant were the fact that women in Ireland have primary responsibility for unpaid childcare and domestic work. There is often expensive and inadequate childcare options, we know that. And we know, especially from the last year or two as well, this idea that the demand for flexible working arrangements in some sectors of the economy is not meeting supply. We also in Ireland have high rates of part-time work for women. And we also have this general narrative that seemed to prevail, certainly a few years ago when I started looking at this kind of narrative and popular perception of freelance work and self-employment as offering some sort of a solution to work-life balance issues. And if you just see, I have some newspaper headlines, this idea of self-employment being some sort of a solution or a way forward, and that women might be turning to freelance work as a way to sort of get increased work-life balance. I'm mindful of time as well, but I'm just going to look at some of the self-employment numbers just for men and women. Now, of course, there is a gender gap in participation, so men are still much more likely to be in self-employment than women. But you can see certainly increases in the numbers here, and particularly quite a steady increase for women, but particularly from around 2017 onwards, you can see quite a sharp increase in the numbers of women in solo self-employment. And similarly for men as well, but it's fluctuating just a little bit more. And then when you look at within it at gender composition, you can see that, again, the proportion of women within self-employment is certainly that gender gap is narrowing quite noticeably as more women move into freelance work. Then I also looked, in the wider research, I looked at parenthood specifically as an impacting factor, but just here, just to look at, quite dramatic changes in the numbers of women with children under 15. So this is labour force survey data that became were in solo self-employment. So you can see quite a large increase in numbers there between around 2017 and 2019. This table, don't worry too much about the numbers. The only thing that is sort of relevant here, because I did look, and remember last year I spoke about working arrangements in particular, but the thing to just take out of this, I looked at labour force survey data in the different years, and the things that sort of came out as quite interesting was increases in part-time work, part-time solo self-employment for women, increases in the proportion of women that cited caring reasons for this part-time work, quite significant increases in that, and just high levels of education and professional experience among the solo self-employed women in Ireland. So without going too much into those particular figures, what I decided to look at today, just to focus on a little bit, was the idea of occupation. This was one element. Now, first of all, my data visualization last night turned out to be pretty terrible, so forgive the chart. And the second thing is, anybody who has worked with labour force survey data knows that it's quite difficult to track changes in occupation over time because of changes in the categorization of the variables. However, I did try to encompass that. I tried to, as best I can, to account for those changes. However, I think, you know, that it does, you do need to be careful looking at changes in occupation. But nevertheless, the most noticeable thing was this increase in professionals, increase in the number of solo self-employed women in this time period. I've lost my arrow here. So just looking up over time with these, with this terrible visualization, but over time you can see rises in the number of professional level occupation. So a fourfold increase in the numbers of self-employed women in professional occupations. And this is, again, we're talking solo self-employed, and also some increase in associate professional and technical occupations as well. And then for sector as well, looking at sort of the different sectors that this type of work is being done in, increases in health sectors. Here you can see health has increased quite a bit there. And again, increase in this whole idea of professional science and technology. Services, oh yeah, that's fine. So, and the numbers of solo self-employed women in education as well has increased. So you can see increases in health, education, the professions, science and technology in this freelance type of work. So just the main findings, as I finish up, that there has been increases in the numbers of women in solo self-employment or freelance work in recent years. An additional 5,000 women with children with under 15 took up solo self-employment between 2015 and 2019. So it's quite a significant increase in numbers. Now, of course, a lot of this would make more sense if it was compared to wage and salaried work, which I have also done, but which I didn't have time to go into here, but they're quite noticeable changes. And a significant narrowing of the gender gap in participation, women more likely than men to be in part-time self-employment, increases in the numbers and proportions of self-employed women in professional level occupations and in health, education and professional sectors of the economy. And there's some evidence to support my overarching hypothesis originally, which was that highly educated and professional women might be turning to freelance self-employment. Now, something which I like to, which I think is kind of interesting just at the moment is this, you know, any work that you're doing looking at flexibility, you know, remote working, work-life balance, it's likely that the impact of the last year or more is going to have, you know, some impact on these trends around that, as increased flexibility has become prevalent in wage and salaried work. So it will be interesting to know whether that impacts the need for people to take up self-employment, but that remains to be seen. Thank you.
Okay, great, Lauren. That was very interesting, and as you say, there really quite timely when we're looking at as you say there at the end there, this move towards possibly more flexible arrangements for salaried employees. One thing actually that occurred to me there when we were looking at the sectoral breakdown there and looking at health, also just to note that health obviously includes social care, and I from work I was looking at actually at the UK level, that there actually tends to be, there is a bit of a surge in sort of what maybe people call bogus self-employment in the care industry, particularly in home care visits and stuff like that. So I'm not sure whether it would be possible to drill down further into that, but it may be that sort of, so it'd be interesting actually to look maybe at the earnings profile maybe within that professional professional sector, just to see whether it is, as you say, maybe, you know, the way people think of professionals in terms of the health sector, you know, it might not just be consultants or specialist doctors.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I certainly think that the whole occupation and sector needs to be really pulled out and really investigated, because I found it quite hard to conceptualize what exactly this data was telling me around that, because I did look at earnings in the SILC data, the Survey on Income and Living Conditions. The problem was it's difficult because the sample size was very small, and you can't pool samples in that particular data. So it wasn't really reliable, but the earnings that I was coming up with were very, very low. Now, how that marries with the categorization into professional occupation, I'm not too sure. I was quite surprised at the prevalence of that category, you know, bearing in mind what you're saying about increasing freelancing and sort of bogus self-employment in the care sector, which would, you know, match those increases in numbers in health. You know, it didn't seem to quite marry together. So I certainly agree that it's an area that would warrant a closer investigation, you know, having a look at maybe a more reliable sample.
Yeah, and just as well, I mean, we were talking there about the increase in people opting for caring responsibilities. That as much as it's kind of coming up on the debate as well with regard to more flexible arrangements for salaried employees as well, with more flexible arrangements, that sometimes the quality of work and employment can suffer as the flexibility tends to fall more on the employee or the self-employed. So sometimes watching quality of work and actual time spent at work is possibly an interesting avenue to look at for this in the future.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's perfect. That's on time. So we are. Thanks very much for that very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our two next speakers who are doing a joint paper, Dr. Michelle Sullivan and Dr. Juliet MacMahon from the University of Limerick. And Juliet, I think you're going to go first. If that's, is that you?
And unmute myself. I'll try and get this to work. Can you see this here? Yeah?
You can indeed. Yeah, I'll leave it to you there now.
Okay, so I know we're stuck on time, so I'll start straight away. So thank you for inviting us to participate and share our work. It's a very particular, I suppose, micro-analysis of a particular situation of what we would call exploitation of Portuguese construction workers in Ireland. And I think it kind of highlights some of the some issues that arise, which I will talk about now. These are just some of the issues that underpinned our study, but also which our study highlighted, which I'd like to go into now before we get into the actual case study. So just to start off, I think it's more or less accepted among labour law commentators that the contract of employment is a contract between unequals. There's unequal bargaining power, and the further down you go in kind of worker hierarchy, the more vulnerable people are to exploitation because of this relationship. So the state here, then the state is under, it has a balancing act in a sense. It's under pressure to protect workers from exploitation. Indeed, some would say it's a duty, but equally the state is under pressure to ensure economic viability, economic success. And in that sense, it often comes under pressure to support labour market flexibility. And oftentimes that some forms of labour market flexibility can be at odds with the ideal of protecting workers from exploitation. Now, the state does intervene in the labour market to protect workers. It enacts labour laws or employment laws. It establishes enforcement bodies like employment tribunals, the judiciary, and labour inspectorates, and we'll be looking at these as we go through the presentation. So the second thing we want to draw your attention to is the issue of wage theft. So very simply, wage theft is, where workers do not get what they're entitled to. Usually it takes more subtle forms such as kind of off the clock hours, not paying tips, providing things like accommodation, or charging workers for accommodation or food, and then those don't accrue. And it's interesting that internationally, bogus self-employment, which was mentioned earlier, is also considered a form of wage theft. Is it a problem? Well, we have a graphic here with some very well-known firms in the US, and all of these have been prosecuted in terms of wage theft. And a study in 2017 by the Economic Policy Institute in the US estimated about 8 billion a year. And they said that was a conservative estimate that workers lost through wage theft. It's also an emerging problem in other countries. And in Ireland, for instance, the WRC annual reports from 2016 to 2018, they say that they recouped 6.5 million in unpaid wages, and in their 2020 report, that was 1.6 million. So it does look like that it is an emerging problem here, or a problem. So the other issue is, how do you stop it? And that might be a point for discussion later on that I won't dwell on now, but it does look like for many companies in the US, where it's widely researched, that the benefits of engaging in it, in spite of being prosecuted, far outweigh the cost to the company. And who's the most vulnerable? Well, as we might expect, migrant workers are most vulnerable to exploitation in general, but to wage theft in particular. Migrant workers have quite a lot of factors that mitigate against them in terms of vulnerability. So there's a lot of intersectionality of factors. They face language barriers. They often lack understanding of the system of the country. They can be isolated from other workers. They can fear loss of jobs. They might find it difficult to move jobs, and thus they don't lack agency totally, but they certainly don't often have a huge amount of agency. The structural dynamics of construction in particular can lend itself to exploitation of migrant workers. You've got these long chains of contracts and subcontracts, often based on cost as you go down the subcontracting chain. So on lower skilled construction workers that are migrant workers might be subject to exploitation. And also the short nature of contracts, people moving around, often means that workers are isolated. So in this particular case study, it was kind of unusual in that the workers here were not workers from accession countries. They weren't workers from outside the EU. They were workers from Portugal, one of the EU 15. And the other thing was that they didn't pursue their rights through maybe traditional forms of collectivization, such as becoming members of a union or union organizing. They pursued their case through legal resistance in the civil courts. And the other unusual thing is how long they stuck with it over the years, when some of them had moved back to Portugal or they weren't domiciled here anymore. But the key questions that we're going to ask is, how effective was legal mobilization as a tactic by this group of migrant workers to remedy their employment rights violations? And how effective was the deployment of multiple arms of the state in remedying the employment rights violations of the migrant workers? So in terms of the methodology, this whole case was described as a long and tortuous saga by one of the judges, I think in the High Court. And you can see there, it was going through the courts from 2009 to 2020, and it's actually not over yet. It appeared in the Equality Tribunal, it appeared in the High Court, the Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court. We analysed these cases, we used interviews with workers' legal team and other informed actors, and we analysed. Now, at the time that this thing was playing out, the construction sector was subject to the registered employment agreements, which are now take the form of SEOs. And we also analysed reports from Industrial Relations News. So the workers at the time were covered by the REAs, and they were also covered by all of the employment acts, such as the Equality Act, the Unfair Dismissals Act, etc. Just in relation to the particular case study, the main contract was awarded to an Irish company, I think by Limerick County Council, And to get that contract, as part of their tender, they had to show that they were complying with employment laws and complying with the REAs at the time. The consortium of Portuguese companies then won the contract down the contract chain as subcontractors to build a section of the Nina motorway between 2007 and 2009. And to do this, they hired 180 approximately Portuguese workers. Now, it's interesting that the workers, when they were hired, when they came to the airport, first of all, these workers, it emerged, there was a preference for workers who had low levels of English or non-existent levels of English, and they had very low literacy as well. And when they arrived at the airport, they were presented with written contracts that would have complied with the REA and would have complied with all facets of employment legislation. But of course, they didn't understand those contracts which they signed. Then they were given oral descriptions of what their working conditions would be. So it turned out that the working conditions were not even as good as they were told they were going to be, rather than those that were in the contract. So I'm just going to read very briefly some of the stuff that emerged when this was going through the High Court as to what the conditions that these workers endured. So accommodation was overcrowded with substandard waste disposal systems, which led to rats, overflowing sewage and waste. They were given huts at the side of the road beside where they were working. Wastewater travelling back from storage units into showers. The accommodation was not connected to main service. There was no source of safe drinking water, and instead water was sourced from groundwater, which was attached to an electrical pump, leading to poor supply and a lack of hot water. There were no changing areas, storage areas for wetter work clothes. Workers experienced skin conditions, and so on. So there was very low levels of health and safety. They were also charged for things like laundry service, which they said they never used. Some had paid deducted by 1,100 euros. Other people were deducted for benefits in kind, like use of a car. One female worker had paid deducted for use of a company car, but she couldn't actually drive. Another worker was deducted 8,000 for use of a car, which he never saw, and so on and so on. So they were pretty grim working conditions. And it's interesting, you know, we talk about different strokes for different folks. There was a female engineer from Portugal who was also employed, and she testified that she actually had really good working conditions. She was given somewhere to live, she was given allowances for food, and so on. The other issue with these workers was that the employer was very openly hostile to them joining trade unions. But what emerged was that they were so isolated anyway from other workers that it was very hard for them to engage at that level anyway. So pretty horrible working conditions, pretty vulnerable workers. But the interesting thing is that they did decide to pursue their rights, and they did it in what might be considered a method. So I'm going to pass you over now to Michelle. I'm not sure if I have to stop sharing and she has to start sharing. No, I'll just turn off my... Juliet, do you want to just flick on to the next slide there? Yeah, I'll get rid of myself though.
So just in terms of the legal actions that the workers took, so primarily what they were looking for is repayment of underpaid wages, particularly overtime pay that they didn't receive for evening and weekend work under the Registered Employment Agreement. And initially they took a case under the Payment of Wages Act 1991 back in 2008, which they lost. Now at that time, and since that time, they have been represented by the same solicitor and by a Portuguese intermediary who was living in Ireland. So these two people basically have formed their legal team since 2008. Now they lost that case primarily because the company produced working time records which conflicted with the workers' own claims about underpaid wages. And it wasn't until a labour inspectorate investigation after this, or that was concluded after this, that the labour inspectors have found that the working time records were falsified based on a whole range of factors, including the labour inspectors had done covert surveillance of the site, and the working time records conflicted with other records that the companies had. So that was a failure in terms of going to the rights commissioners, and the workers then decided to try and go to the Equality Tribunal, 10 workers, and they took a range of cases for race discrimination. And the employers settled those before Equality Tribunal could decide on the substantive issues. And they settled that case for about €140,000, which was shared amongst the 10 employees. The legal team decided to go further and they submitted civil court actions to the High Court in 2012 for 26 workers. There was mostly construction workers, and there was one female cleaner as well. And they did this because they basically felt that they would have a better chance of discovering information about the company by the discovery process in the civil courts, as opposed to the employment rights bodies like the rights commissioners, which were very dependent on the documents that were produced by the company in hearings. They took claims for breach of contract for the underpaid REA wages, and they also claimed breach of contract in regard to the charges that the employees had paid in regard to laundry, accommodation, and food. So it was 6 years later, in 2016, when the High Court ruled on that, and they ruled in the workers' favour, and they awarded damages for breaches of contract in all of those areas except meals. So they awarded damages for underpaid wages, which was estimated to be at least €3 million of an underpayment for the 180 Portuguese workers. And that was considered a conservative estimate by Judge Keane. He also awarded damages for laundry and also for accommodation. Now, the reason why the cases have gone on so long is because of the number of appeals by the employers. So in the space of 3 years up until 2019, the employers issued 14 or lodged 14 appeals of previous court decisions. None of those appeals were ever about the substantive issue of the underpaid wages. They were always about other things, in particular, the fact that Judge Keane in the High Court awarded interest on top of the damages, and also in terms of the damages that he awarded for accommodation and laundry and so on. What was interesting about those later appeals is, one is that a later court, the Court of Appeal, allowed the workers to sue the companies for the mental distress arising from the very poor accommodation. And also, it wasn't until 2020, after all those series of appeals, that eventually the final appeals by the employers were dismissed by the courts. But more recently, the employers have submitted a claim to the European Court of Human Rights because they are claiming unfair treatment by the Irish judicial system. And the workers' legal team would see that as a way of trying to stop the payment of the money and court orders from Portugal. That it's difficult for the legal team to be able to get the money while there are challenges still in train by the employers. So we see a lot of legal actions which have taken a very long time. Juliet, you might just go on to the next one, please. So back to the research questions. In terms of how effective was legal mobilization, very quickly, well, we can see that going to the civil courts in many respects was successful or effective in the sense that the courts did as much as was within their power for the most part to be able to remedy exploitation. You have large awards given to the workers, but of course these large awards and these positive outcomes are very dependent on the workers having resources to take these cases, and in particular it's the legal team who have borne the cost, the financial cost of taking these cases. Obviously the time involved, it's still ongoing, so the workers have still not received all the awards and the damages that they were entitled to. And getting the employer to pay, which of course is a perennial problem, has been a difficulty for the workers as well. And we don't really have time to go into all the legal efforts that they've made in that regard. In terms of the deployment of multiple arms at the state, what you can say is, well, obviously a particular problem in terms of the dispute resolution process is, one, they're very dependent on the documents which are produced by the employers as being true. And also as well, the fact that there's only a 6-month time limit on many cases being brought under employment law is problematic because workers may not have the knowledge or time to be able to understand their rights before taking cases. And by the time the labour inspectors had finished their investigation, which was seen as critical to the success of the workers, the time limits had expired in terms of employment law options. The fact that you have remedies after the fact that you do only have that 6 months after a particular breach of employment legislation to take case is very problematic, obviously, then for temporary migrant workers. The labour inspectors already mentioned their investigative powers were incredibly important to the success of the workers in the case, but a significant enforcement gap is the fact that the labour inspectors do not actually have the power to enforce the pay rates under the registered employment agreements or subsequently under the SEOs. They only have the power to check working time records, but not the actual pay rates. And finally, what you can say was, well, obviously this has serious questions for the role of the state. The state would seemingly have good protections in terms of the design and enforcement of laws, but we have to recognise that one, there wasn't labour inspectorate enforcement powers of the REAs that we mentioned, but also the state has to recognise it's a beneficiary of exploitation. The very fact that you have some construction companies are able to produce cheaper bids on the back of lower pay rates or non-payment for work of workers, well, then it's the state that ends up benefiting from that. So the state has to make a political choice between social equity and competitiveness outcomes for the economy and for society. And any chink in the enforcement armour dilutes effectiveness. So even if you have free dispute resolution bodies, well, if there's any gap at all in enforcement of employment rights, that's very problematic. And ultimately, the difficulties the workers have had in getting their awards across countries has been very problematic and is something that EU policy has to work on much more. We can talk much more at a later stage or with anyone who's interested about considerations for how this can be resolved. There's a lot of discussion internationally about wage theft laws, particularly in Australia and America. And separately, we're looking at wage theft in the context of minimum wage and working time legislation. But there is this overarching question about the extent to which transnational companies and globalization impacts labour law enforcement, and to what extent a nation state is strong enough to be able to combat transnational employment and labour and capital mobility. But we'll leave it there for the moment because I know our time is up. Thank you very much.
That's great, Michelle and Juliet. I just one brief question to start with was with regard to when you said that the Labour Inspectorate was came in to investigate. I may have missed it. How did that come about after? How did they come to be involved in investigating the veracity of the evidence of the work, the timesheets that the employer had brought forward in the first case? What instigated that?
Complaints were made to the labour inspectors. So SIPTU had made a complaint, and there also had been complaints made. It's not clear if it's the labour inspector or the county council by local residents because machinery was working or operating at much later hours than what was supposed to be allowed by the contract. So the labour inspector then did on-site investigations and obviously interviewed workers and looked at documents. The critical part was the fact that the logs for the company's machinery operation diverged from the working time records. So they could see that the machinery was working late at night and the weekends, but the working time records were telling a different story.
That's quite interesting. And actually up here in Northern Ireland, we had yesterday an announcement from the Minister for Finance about the Procurement Board, which is bringing forward a social value bill, and among other things is looking at guaranteeing living wage for all government contracts. I'm just wondering, in terms of procurement policy in the Republic, is there, is this on the table in terms of significant policy development there, that the state at the very least should not be within a country mile of this these kind of practices?
Yeah, it has been. In the last couple of months, there has been discussions about public procurement and what criteria contracting authorities should be looking at. Obviously, it can be conflicts between looking at lower price tenders and other, wider social equity goals. We have seen some examples more recently, only in the last couple of weeks, with Dublin City Council cooperating with the Trades Union Federation about trade union officials inspecting public procurement contracts within Dublin City Council region. And that would be, obviously one way of trying to ensure better compliance. There are other bodies. There are county council inspectors. There are other bodies, involved, and other bodies were involved, intermittently along the way with these workers. But part of the difficulty as well, even if, with regard to example, the labour inspectors, is that, even if they did have the power to enforce the REA pay rates, what do they do then? There have been limitations up to now in terms of the information that they can give local authorities in the absence of a conviction. If you look at other countries, for example, most recently in California in the last couple of years, they've introduced powers for the equivalent of the labour inspectors, which involves the state having powers to levy the bank accounts of companies which are found to have underpaid employees. There's things like stop work licenses, where they are stop work orders, where inspectorates can order companies to stop working until underpaid wages are paid. So that, I think, is a critical part. The finding of the issue is one part, but actually what you do then, and going through dispute resolution process. And the labour inspectors did get a conviction in the district court, but that wasn't until 2011, and the fines are very low. The penalties can include, for example, that construction company shouldn't have been able to apply for EU public procurement funding in the future. But the maximum fine for falsified working time records in the district court is €2,500. So if you're not interested in EU public procurement in the future, well, then the fine is very low, and obviously it's a couple of years after the fact.
There's just one small point that I'd like to add to that, and it's not to do with public procurement, but the whole issue of contracting chains in construction industry. There's a bill that's just about to be enacted if the governor of New York signs it into law, whereby the main contractor at the top of the chain actually would now be liable for wage theft carried out by contractors further down the subcontracting chain. It'll be interesting to see if it's signed and if it goes into law, how effective it is, but it's certainly a move. I think it's welcomed by the construction sector in the US. So we'll see how that pans out.
That's very interesting. That's and that idea of holding the responsibility at the top of the chain, I think, would actually make a much bigger difference along that. Listen, that was a very interesting paper. Thank you very much. You filled in a good bit of knowledge I didn't have on a lot of this. So thank you very much, both Juliet and Michelle. So we're going to move to Robert Sweeney from TASC next. Robert is going to present a paper on job quality in the Irish construction sector. God, that's well timed. Robert, if you want to pop up your slides there, whatever, I will hide myself away here and let you at it.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and a very interesting presentation by Michelle and Juliet, and also Lauren before. So this presentation is on job quality in the construction sector, looking at many aspects of job quality. We were commissioned by the Chartered Institute of Building to do this work, and this presentation will look at a number of things. Just a profile of the sector in terms of who works there, gender, nationality, and occupational structure. Look at pay in the sector, and what we find is that in aggregate, the construction sector is well paid in Ireland, but there's quite large disparities between different occupational groups. So Ireland's good pay is largely driven by very well remunerated white collar pay, whereas trades and particularly less skilled labourers are below European norms. Contractual stability, there is still elevated levels of precariousness since the financial crisis, although there has been improvement. And if I have time to get to it, I'll look at non-monetary factors as well, such as job autonomy, work intensity, and so on. So just quickly, construction employment as a percentage of total employment, and as Lauren alluded to in her presentation, that there are issues in measuring employment trends over time because of changing definitions of sectors and occupations as well. But nevertheless, as we can see, the construction sector was about 10% of employment in 2000, and then it went to about 13% in 2006, the height of the construction bubble. That bubble burst and it went to about 4%, and in 2019 at least it was around 6% of total employment, and that's around EU norms, is what you'd expect it to be. Now, arguably Ireland should be higher because of our housing shortages. Again, it's quite male dominated. I should have written down what this percentage is here, but I believe it's about 94% of those working in the sector are male. They're mostly born in Ireland as well. I think about 20% are from outside the country in terms of where they're born, at least. I'll get to that shortly in a bit more detail. Unionisation in the Irish construction sector. I'm sure NERI is interested in this. It's a somewhat depressing story, I'm afraid to say. So in 1994, almost half of the workforce were unionised. That fell to 27% in 2004, and it was stable then for a few years, and then since the crisis it has fallen to about 17%, 16.8%. I would say that the first two data points are based on CSO study, and the second two are based on a little poster that infographic that NERI did. I think it was Kieran Nugent who did that, but I need to verify if these are the same definitions, but certainly because this is from the same group, we do see a big fall between 1994 and 2004, and this is also the latter two are also from the same study, shall we say, and definitely there has been a fall post-crisis as well, post-financial crisis. Okay, looking at the composition of the workforce. So now with the labour force survey, which is what I used here, you can disaggregate a little bit further in terms of the occupational groups, but managers are, directors, senior management. Professional would be things like architects, engineers, associate professional, health and safety officers and stuff like that, maybe some estimators and stuff, quantity surveyors are professionals though. Clerical, administrative, craft workers, electricians, carpenters and so on, and then manual would be labourers, but it's also, I recall, I conflated a couple of groups into the manual one. It was labourers and also like unskilled machine operators. So obviously clerical is the most important occupational group numerically. 57% of the workforce in 2019 were clerical workers, and then manual, i.e. labourers and some machine operators were about 18%, and we see that this is very male dominated, these professions here. 99% of craft workers are men, and 99.8% of manual workers in construction are men. We also see that the somewhat less skilled, the manual workers, non-Irish born, are a considerable portion of the workforce for manual workers. There, about 28% are born outside of Ireland, and this might well be an underestimation because the labour force survey is based on people, I understand, who are ordinarily resident in the country, so workers who come here temporarily for a few months. I don't think are captured in the labour force survey. Maybe someone can tell me that, but that's what I understand, which speaks to the presentation made previously. The one occupational group where there are mostly women is the clerical group, and then you look at the more qualified or white collar workers. It's similar story as to the aggregate sector. It's mostly men. Directors mostly men. non-Irish born, there isn't much variations. It's about 1 in 5 for most, except for managers, where it's 1 in 10 are born outside of Ireland. Managers being directors and senior management. So then I looked at pay in the sector and compared Ireland to other European countries. So the measure of pay was what's called full-time monthly equivalent labour income. It's a measure used by Eurostat. This is based on EU Silk data. Labour income is income from employment, i.e. employee income, plus self-employment income. And it's important, particularly in a construction context, to include self-employment income because of the high rates of self-employment in the sector, which I'll get to. Full-time monthly equivalent means that there's an adjustment for working time. So it's as if everyone is working full-time. So it's very similar to the hourly wage, basically. And then what I did was I benchmarked it against economy-wide earnings, basically. Now, if you use CSO data, not from Silk, is it the Labour Force Survey does earnings? I can't, you know, the data set I'm talking about. It's somewhat lower, but in the EU Silk data set, it's almost pay in the construction sector is almost the same as economy-wide earnings, basically. And that places Ireland somewhat above most European Union countries. But then I separated just the construction workforce in general and white-collar workers. White-collar workers being anyone who's not a craft or manual worker. So it's management professional, associate professional, and clerical. Arguably, I shouldn't include clerical, but it's not a big portion of the workforce. And we see that white-collar workers in Ireland are amongst the best. White-collar construction workers are amongst the best paid in Europe, in Ireland, when you benchmark it against the average earnings in the economy. I think only Austria was actually better, but the Austrian figures are a little bit all over the place, and I was a bit doubtful of them. The sample size was kind of small, so it may well be the case that white-collar construction workers are the best paid in Ireland compared to any European Union country. And then what I did was I looked at craft and manual as well, again, benchmarked against economy-wide earnings. So in Ireland, craft workers earn about 80% of average earnings or pay in Ireland, and that puts it a little bit below most European Union countries. So we go from slightly above when you just look at the aggregate figures, and then slightly somewhat below when you look at the craft workers. And then if you look at manual workers, we slip further down the rankings again. So their pay is the 7th lowest out of 25 countries for which I had data for. And so although construction sector pay is in aggregate quite good in Ireland, for most of the workforce, so craft and manual workers comprise most construction workers, their earnings are actually not that good by European Union standards. Then I looked at precarity in the sector, so the proportion of the workforce who are on temporary contracts. So we look at construction, there was a big increase in temporary contracts during the financial crisis, but it has come down since then, but it still remains elevated. So just under 6% were on temporary contracts in 2019, which is considerably higher to what it was in the year 2000. But funnily enough, actually, construction is actually doing better than the rest of the economy. So if you look at the rest of the economy, yes, there were a significant amount of temporary contracts in 2000, but and that became elevated during the 2000s and during the crisis years. But unlike for construction, the rest of the economy, temporary contracts hasn't really come down so much. Then you look at craft workers, and it basically follows a trend similar to construction in general. You had an increase in the 2000s and a particularly big increase during the height of the crisis. But then there has been a reduction in temporary contract work among craft workers, but it hasn't come down to the levels it was at in 2000. Caveats should be made about, as I mentioned, somewhat changing definition of occupations over time. You look at involuntary part-time work, reasonably good outcomes here, actually. So you look at construction work as a whole, there was a very marked increase in involuntary part-time work during the financial crisis. Very, very large increase, but it has basically come back to levels of what it was pre-crisis. Involuntary part-time work among craft workers is basically the same trend as the construction sector in general. And if you look at the rest of the economy by the white points here, what we see is that a similar trend to the construction sector, but obviously not as pronounced an increase in involuntary part-time work during the crisis. Obviously, other sectors weren't hit quite as hard as the construction sector when the bubble burst around 2009, 2010, basically. But if you look at solo self-employment, which is kind of a proxy, which is a proxy for, for bogus self-employment. Obviously, there is solo self-employment, which is legitimate self-employment. You would have, especially in smaller towns and stuff like that, quite a lot of, I guess, electricians and so on who would work for themselves. And so not all of solo self-employment is bogus self-employment, but it is somewhat of a proxy. And in particular, if you look at the rest of the economy, the trend in solo self-employment, i.e., self-employment without workers, the rest of the economy, the non-construction economy, it really hasn't changed much. So despite the fact that solo self-employment is an imperfect measure of bogus self-employment, when there's such a step change, and it's clearly due to the crisis, and particularly among craft workers here, you'd have to think that the vast majority of the increase in solo self-employment is bogus self-employment. It has come down, notwithstanding if you look at the level in, say, 2019 and the level in any given year, not all of that is bogus self-employment, but certainly the very large increase and the elevated levels of solo self-employment today points to a problem of bogus self-employment in the sector. I also looked at a few non-monetary aspects of job quality. This is from the European Working Conditions Survey. It's the Euro-found survey. Fortunately, the latest wave was 2015. I think and it was postponed because of coronavirus. And I think the latest wave is due to be out this year, if it hasn't already been released. And I looked at a number of measures of job autonomy. And basically, I looked at, say, if the workers are consulted on workplace time, if they're able to apply their own ideas most or all of the time, do they participate in workplace improvements most or all of the time, and similarly, if they influence decisions most or all of the time. And I compared construction to the rest of the economy. And interestingly, I mean, not surprisingly, given the facts, the nature of the industry, construction work does provide for somewhat more autonomy than the non-construction work. And that's probably due to the nature of the fact that a lot of construction projects are bespoke projects in which the workers have to use their own skills and ingenuity. So it just doesn't lend itself to standardization, and it's not like an assembly line. So it makes sense that the workforce has a significant degree of autonomy. Then I looked at work pace. The survey asked workers, are they working at high speed more than half of the time? Are they working to very tight deadlines more than half of the time? And also there was a number of questions about to what extent they have control over their workplace. So there was 5 questions there, and if they answered 3 of those 5, they were deemed to have little control over the pace of the work. Like the 5 questions included things like, is the work pace determined by external factors such as demands of the boss, the speed of machine, and so on. I think not huge differences between the rest of the economy on average, but there is evidence that at least when you look at many people working at high speeds and the extent of control, that the construction workers were under more time pressure from when you compare 2005 to 2015. That possibly as a result of the poor labor market at that time, and maybe the employers just had more power to potentially squeeze. But that might have changed since. Obviously, this is like 6 years old now, so it would be interesting to see what the findings are in the most recent survey. The report, which is available on the TASC website, I would say looked at a number of other things. Interestingly, Irish building sites are actually among the safer in the European Union. So we have the joint sixth lowest rate of fatal injuries. And most people in construction believe that it's meaningful work. It's not useless, of course. Findings: construction is very male-dominated. Construction pay relative to average is good in Ireland, but that's largely driven by very high white-collar pay in the sector. Less qualified pay is below average by European Union standards. Precariousness is still elevated, especially bogus self-employment. Construction workers have more autonomy than other workers. And yeah, thank you.
Great. Robert, I just have one quick question before we move on to Alicja. Just in terms of, have you come across, when you were looking at this, any way of getting a greater handle on bogus self-employment in terms of being able to categorize it more accurately, I suppose, because it's one that keeps coming back up again?
Unfortunately not, to be honest with you. I use solo self-employment. Yeah. And I think, despite the fact that it overstates the level, it's very clear that the increase in solo self-employment is due to bogus self-employment. But that was the best I could get. Maybe Alicia's done some work in this before as well, so maybe she can say something about that.
Well, that's a rather good intro. So our next speaker up is Dr. Alicja Bobek from Trinity College Dublin, presenting a joint paper she had with Sinéad, Pembroke and James Wickham, and Routes to Precariousness, the expansion of fixed-term contracts in the higher education and early childcare education sectors. So Alicja, take it away there.
Hi. Thank you for inviting us to present our findings. And today I will focus on the precarious work in 2 specific sectors: in the Irish higher education, in the early childcare education in Ireland. So it's based on the project that we had done a couple of years ago in TASC, and what prompted us to come up with the project, which was called Social Implications of Precarious Work, were findings from the previous study that revealed that in post-recession Ireland, we have overall flexibilization of employment. Both is the flexibility for employer than an employee, and that it has implications across the occupational structure. So it's not only the bottom, and also beyond the workplace. So things like housing or health, or basically planning for the future. And in the social implication of precarious work, we looked at so-called contractual objective precarity. So it was irregular part-time work, fixed-term contracts, and self-employment. And as Rob pointed out, the bogus self-employment will be the sole self-employment will be the one that we would be looking at. But to come back to that question, no, I don't think that there is a better measure for that from the official stats. So we also looked at solo self-employment. And that the core was a qualitative study, which included interviews with stakeholders, but more importantly, 40 precarious workers. And we did some analysis of back then the QNHS and some other census data as well. What I need to say about the sample, we had an overrepresentation of precarious workers with professional jobs and people with third-level education. So we shifted in our focus towards what you could call middle-class precarity. So not the typical, what you find in the literature, the bottom level of the labor market, not really the top, more kind of in the middle, so middle-class jobs. And what we found, the main findings were the importance of social implications and the impact of precarious work. So the overall career paths, but then housing, family formation, and health, which I mentioned already. Now to tell you just a couple of things about this over-focus on professional jobs. You can expect that to happen from the overall proportion of higher education amongst the all workforce in Ireland that has changed from 1999, you can see, down to the 2019, that's what I have the last, it really expanded. There was a push towards the third level education. And it also is revealed in the stats on the 3 types of precarious work. Now, part-time employment, I have to say, not all of that is irregular, but you can have some indication to show that more and more, the higher and higher proportion of those in part-time work are have third-level degree. It's the same with the own account work, which is the solo self-employment. But quite importantly in this one, I kind of want to show you the temporary work, how it's changed. So from 20% in 1999 to slightly over 30% 2008, and then 2018, it's 40% of those who have temporary jobs have third-level education. Now, I've been trying to see as well what type of precarious work people, what type of temporary jobs people are doing, because that indicates professional versus non-professional. But unfortunately, for between 2007 and 2009, there is a massive proportion of people who didn't declare, so it's not stated. So we don't know whether it was casual or fixed term. Nevertheless, you can see that it is growing amongst those who have third-level education. I'm going to quickly have a look at the overall characteristics and the importance of precarious work, but probably we all know what characteristics it has. So it's the relative ease of dismissal and security, but also often low levels of job satisfaction and low levels of autonomy and the little control of working time. Quite important, more subjective characteristics of precarious work. Quite importantly as well, it's agreed that it's been growing through macro structural changes, the rise of neoliberal ideology, and the overall deregulation of employment relationship. It has been historically associated with work done by women. This is important for the childcare sector that I will talk about in a minute, but also migrants, but it's spreading to the so-called advantaged male population. The question a couple of questions I would like to ask here is that the discussion in the international literature is still focused on the low-paid and low-skilled work, while the high-skilled employment is still often discussed within this frame of unboundarious careers, which implicates that people are in control of the job change. But very little is also said about the role of state in shaping precarious employment. I think Michelle has a very good paper on that from last year. It's about the state's policies that maybe not create, but definitely shape the increase of precarious work. And also what I would like to do here in this presentation is focus on precarization of specific sectors, roots to precarity that happens, not the overall economy. And here is the higher education sector in Ireland and the early childcare. So in terms of the higher education, I think we all know what's been going on over the past few decades, and international literature, there's loads of evidence that on one hand, there is the growing importance of the knowledge economy, but on the other hand, the massification and marketization of the higher education and the emergence of the neoliberal university. As a result, internationally, you have the division between the core and the periphery. So the periphery are teaching only and research only positions that are on the rise. And the emphasis on mobility and hyper-productivity as well. So it's been agreed that, for example, international mobility is often a precondition to reaching stable employment in higher education. So in order to get a permanent job, you have to first move not between institutions, but also between countries. And that also results in the emergence of the immobile casual academics. So people who are bound to a location, for example, because of their family situation in the home country. So that has been happening in Ireland for a while now, and I think that what needs to be emphasized here is that it predates the recession. So we have the traditional division between the academic staff and the support personnel. Both. There has been, first of all, expansion of third-level education happened before the recession, and the emphasis on research and international competition, again, predates the recession. But that coincides with the public sector recruitment freeze that happened after 2008, overall cost in funding, then ongoing emphasis on externally funded research projects, and a massive growth in importance of the international students. So the results are twofold. On one hand, in the teaching realm, it's the expansion of so-called adjunct lecturers. So the Cash report found that universities employed 40% lecturers on fixed-term basis, and quite often even more peripheral, they wouldn't have proper contracts. And the increasing number of specific purpose contracts for those who are externally funded. So the increase between 2013 and 2018 was 30%. And most of those who are employed in research jobs in universities are on temporary contracts. So the first result here is obviously the fragmented careers. And I don't think I have time to read through those quotes in details, but there are quotes. First one is from a researcher on a fixed-term contract. The second one is from the lecturer. And in the first quote, the interviewee described their roots, career roots, from doing the PhD to the time of the interview. And in about 2 years, you can see how many times they changed their job. They had something for 1 year, then they had something for 3 months, then 6 months, then a few months, and then they're in the current position. So quite a lot of change that is involuntary. And the second quote emphasizes the agreement and the sense that there isn't any permanent positions in this sector. So there is some departments and schools that you would see that, but in others, the only way to do it is to win a large research award, the European Research Award. That's the route to get the permanent contract. So that's the higher education sector, and this whole shift towards temporary work that was the result of the on one hand, the increase in the third level enrollments, but the cuts as well, and the increasing emphasis on the research. What happened in the Irish childcare education, I think it's even more interesting how the state here had an influence on shaping the precarious work. So when I looked at the international literature, maybe somebody can help me. It's actually an ongoing work on a working paper that article that I'm writing at the moment. There's very little discussion on the childcare and precarious work. Most of it is low pay, ongoing professionalization, and increased involvement of the state, particularly in the UK, so the regulations. In Ireland, historically speaking, well, there's been all prolonged reliance on informal arrangements. So the formal care has been underdeveloped, the housewife model was dominant. Then from the early 2000s, the expansion of the private for-profit centers, and quite importantly, the involvement of state that stepped in around 2006 with the regulations. But still, most kids were cared for by parent or guardian, and that had changed by the introduction of the early childcare and education scheme, 2010, expanded 2016. which results with the overall successful uptake of the scheme amongst children and parents, but also the increase in employment in this sector. And quite importantly, I have to emphasize here the increased emphasis on the staff qualification. So if you want to work in childcare, in a formal childcare, you need to have FETEC, I think, level 5 at least or higher. But the thing is that actual scheme runs only for 3 hours a day and 38 weeks per calendar year. So that resulted not only in expansion of employment in the sector, but many now work on temporary contracts. So we spoke to a few couple of early years education professionals, and the first quote here is quite extreme, where the interviewee says that she had never, in her previous workplace, never had an actual contract. She was basically on call, that she was called, well, you can work Wednesday, Thursday, Friday this week. Next week maybe working Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Oh, can you come tomorrow? So she had no guaranteed hours, so she left. And the second quote illustrates quite well what's going on in the sector and how the 38 weeks per year work. So what this interviewee said, it's that here, quote, we are the same as the primary school with the same holidays. So whenever they close, we close too, but we don't get paid. So unlike teachers, over the summer months, the childcare sector workers, teachers need to go on the dole. So the contract ends in June and basically they are re-employed in September. Now, in both sectors, what came through the interviews a lot was that partially this sort of expectation to accept those working conditions come through the sense of vocation, responsibility, and the willingness to do unpaid work. Again, two quotes. First one from a teaching fellow who had done quite a lot of unpaid teaching, actually 69 extra hours in term. And what this person said here, quote, they said, and at the same time, I felt a sense of a responsibility. If I say I don't want to teach it, who's going to do it? And I know it's wrong of me because I should have said, well, if I get paid, I will do it. But you know, when you have such a close relationship with people you work with, you feel that you're putting them on the spot and you feel like you're being unfair. End of quote. So there is a willingness to do unpaid work because of close networks, because of the next job that can come in, and because you feel like you're supposed to do that because you love your job. And it's very similar for the early years education sector. Came across interviewees talking about the so-called non-contact hours. So what happens is that people are being paid for the time that they are caring for the kids, but all the admin work, there is no time to do that. So they have to do it in their spare time. So here the interviewee said, and I quote, yeah, they call it non-contact hours. I was forever bringing stuff home with me, trying to finish them off, but you just don't get time. And end of quote here, but what she said as well, I find it really interesting about this dedication vocation. Again, quoting from her interview, you don't get paid for the extra work, but you do it for the love of the job. You do it because of the little kids' faces. It's what mom and dad expect, what your manager expects of you, and you have to do it for the children. Otherwise, you shouldn't be in childcare. So quite striking quote, I find. Again, emphasizing that, so what that you're going to get paid? Somebody needs to do that, and it's going to be you. And finally, of course, amongst other consequences, it results in a lot of stress and worry about the future. So the first quote from a researcher on a fixed-term contract who says, yeah, it's permanently thinking about the next job. That's what he said. So what he talks about in this interview is about constantly applying for work and that having consequences for his mental health, but also for the family everyday living, because the whole interview, when I read it, he kept talking about his wife putting hopes that the next job will be the better job, that the next job will lead to something permanent, but it doesn't. And he applied for so many jobs over the past 4 or 5 years, and they were all temporary. Second quote from the early years education professional, what she said, and I quote here, definitely stress. Coming up to summer as well, when there's like, what am I gonna do? And last year, there was a real panic and getting that work done, the whole summer was stressful because of that. End of quote here. And then she continued talking about the low pay and the dole and the fact that basically you have nothing to do. So those summer months where schools are closed, the childcare teachers basically need to go and claim the social welfare. So to conclude, because I'm quite aware of the fact that we're over time, one thing I would like to explore more, I guess, in relation to this paper is the policies and their indirect effects on employment relationship. So in the actual scheme, that's quite straightforward, that the fixed-term jobs were created because of the creation of the scheme, but there is also the increased emphasis on quality of service and staff qualifications. So what I call it is the professionalization of former casual work. So childcare, historically speaking, it was associated with female and women's job, and now it's being regularized, but still kept precarious. On the other hand, in the higher education, the whole shift was the reliance on external funding for research, but also lack of proper lectureships and the reliance of people willing to do those extra teaching, well, extra, the main job, but it's the extra for the department, extra teaching hours. That is what we would call the precarization of jobs that requires much higher levels of education. So the two kind of processes coming simultaneously. Now, it has consequences for the workers, of course. So the fragmented careers, horizontal mobility, lack of career prospects, inability to plan for the future, work and outside of work, but also social consequences. So like, quite clearly very difficult, for example, to get a mortgage or plan to have a child when you don't know what's going to happen in a year or 2 years' time. But I think if you want to influence any policy, what should be looked at is the consequences for employers, for students, for children, for wider society. So on one hand, there is a huge staff turnover in both sectors, and there is, I think, a massive loss of experience. So workers are on the move, but they usually start from the lowest position again and again and again as they start the new job. But also the whole question about the quality of teaching in higher education, quality of research in higher education when you constantly employ new people to do the thing, and then the childcare. And I think especially in the early years education, it's important that the kids become attached to the teachers. And if there is, every month or so, there is a new teacher because of the staff turnover, that has consequences for the services as well. So that's all from me. Thank you. Yep.
Alicia, that's very interesting, and I do particularly like bringing together those two sectors, one where it's being casualized down and one where it's being professionalized up. But I wonder, and you kind of touched on it there at the end in terms of where this shift came from in the third level education sector. Could you look at sort of the reduction of core funding to universities over the years as really the genesis of that shift? And that without
that's my time.
Without that core fund, that the absence of the core funding really and the decline of the core funding really gave birth to the greater use of temporary contracts, because if the funding is temporary, so is the employment, and that we couldn't have expected anything maybe different if we changed the funding model of higher education drastically.
No, it's a very good point, and I will definitely take that on board, because I was looking only at the characteristics of employment, but I wasn't looking at the overall figures on the funding. But I think that one needs to be cautious here, because I think that, there's also an expansion in employment because of the expansion of the third level sector, but that comes in line with the reduction in funding overall. But I think it will be easy because they definitely differentiate between employment that comes from exchequer and non-exchequer. So I guess that it will be easy to find the source for that as well. Yeah, no, it's a very good point. Thank you.
Great, brilliant. Oh, look, that's us. We're only marginally over time. So I'm going to call a session there. But my thanks to all our speakers, to Lauren, to Michelle and Juliet, to Robert, and to you, Alicia. That was really a very interesting session, and some really great presentations. But I will officially release everybody for lunch and say to you that you are coming back after lunch at 1:10 I think, for the next session, if you are so inclined. But that's it from us. Thanks to all our speakers again, and thanks to everyone for watching online. That's great.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.